As you're playing Forged Alliance Forever, there are going to be a lot of different things that influence your overall experience with the game. Your playstyle, the playstyle of your teammates, how good your teammates are, how good you are, what faction you picked. But probably one of the bigger things that might go overlooked is the map that you're actually playing on, as far as what your overall experience is. And this leads a lot of players to say things like, this map is garbage, or he's a 1600 rated player but only plays dual gaps, all you did was turtle, etc, etc, etc. All these are things that FAF players, myself included, use to criticize maps, other players, and other things. So this is going to be mostly about maps. We're going to be looking at maps that a lot of the people that I play with would regularly look at and say they are bad. And so we're going to look at these maps and say, are they actually bad? If they are bad, what makes a bad map? And if they're bad, why are they so popular? And finally, we'll look at what, in my opinion, makes a good map. So let's get into it. So the main maps we're going to be talking about today, and it should come as no surprise, we're going to pick on three kind of different groups today as our quote unquote bad map examples. The first is going to be Astro Crater and all its variants, Dual Gap and all its variants. Well, not all of its variants, and then Thermo or You Shall Not Pass. Now, these maps have tons of different flavors, but they generally all fall into kind of a very similar formula, and they're played quite often. And normally, anytime you log into FAF, it's pretty much a guarantee that you'll find at least one of these maps, often multiple, with various mods applied. So they're very popular. There's obviously a lot of people that are actually playing these maps. If you go and pull up Astro on replays, you'll find dozens of replays every single day of players playing these maps. So now we need to ask, what are the problems with these maps? Are they actually bad? And if so, what makes them bad? So there are several culprits that are blamed here commonly. The first is they're played entirely around choke points. Gameplay is very static with no variation. They limit strategic choice, and they encourage players to learn the game incorrectly, quote unquote, incorrectly. And that is, the last one is probably the biggest one, and the one that is most often cited by several different players as well as casters. One of the early streams that I watched from Brink back whenever he was still streaming said exactly this, was, you know, if players want to play Astro, that's great, but it teaches them to the game incorrectly. And to some extent, these are true. So let's look at each individual map and pick out some of the things and attributes about them. So Astro and all its variations, they have a couple of key attributes. There's one or very few avenues of land attack into another player's base. These are easily covered with point defense or Tech 2 artillery, encouraging a lot of early turtling. A comparatively large amount of core mass, meaning mass points that are in the immediate base relative to the rest of the map, and a general design that restricts the ability to use air or navy. So it makes air and navy just overall less effective and less viable. Now, whenever we get into You Shall Not Pass, once again, a couple different variations, but they share a lot of the same things. One, primary narrow points of attack. Mass points are concentrated in your base compared to being spread out across the map. And in this particular instance, there is actually no water, so no navy, which in and of itself is not a huge problem, as tons of maps have no navy. But air isn't super viable either, as bases are so condensed. So even if you have no air control, it's easy to defend with surface air missiles or flak. Normally we would see that there is a trade-off where you have to get SAMs in a lot of different areas instead of just condensing them into one area. Now, Dual Gap gets a little bit more interesting. So it does have choke points, and there are a couple of the primary ones, most notably at kind of the mouth of the rivers going into each team's base. But unlike the previous maps, they do have a pretty significant amount of mass in the middle area, often meaning that when this middle area is taken over, it is very hard to retake because of the choke points, and the team that controls the middle often wins the game. And the one thing that all of these maps have in common is the game is often decided by who can produce more artillery, Novax, nukes, or other game enders. And this, I believe, is the crux of the problem with these maps. They are decided by late game, long range bombardment. Now, there are obvious exceptions to these where an Astro game might be decided by a mass experimental rush, but I still think that that kind of falls into the same category. Big late game investments and a lack of early game encouragement, a lack of encouraging early game combat. Now, there are times where the players that don't control the middle do win in dual gap. I get quite a few dual gap games sent to me. But a large majority fall into the category of you control the middle, you'll win the game. Now, those are the problems that I see with those maps, but let's take a step back and just say, in general, what makes a map bad? Now, I believe that a bad map is a map that restricts a win condition to a particular style of play to a point where other strategies are not viable regardless of your position. Now, obviously on maps you're going to have play style dictated to some extent by your spawn position on the map. So for example, you're in the back and you don't have as many mexes, it's more difficult for you to deploy land, you're going to be playing air, and if you do play land, it's not going to be a good time for either you or your team. I streamed a game where I was in a position and everybody in chat was asking me to go for a 20-minute Monkey Lord, so that's what I tried to do. And then I realized, oh shit, I was supposed to be actually playing air this game, and we ended up losing that game. So there are going to be situations where the map and your spawn position on the map kind of dictate the way that you are going to need to play based on your position, but I don't really think that that necessarily factors in. And so what I mean is that the overall team strategy is pigeonholed into one particular strategy. So if we take almost any Neuroxis map, you have, depending on how many spawn positions you have, between 4 to 6, you usually have a band of frontline players and then one player that is in the back that is playing air. This means that a lot of the strategies, whether it be land, whether it be T2 air snipes, whether it be late game, artillery, nukes, all of which are pretty viable. But they're not, the map itself is not forcing a team to take one particular strategy. So let's take, for example, this game that I casted several months ago, where victory was more dictated by player decision rather than making the map force you to play in a particular way. So this is a 3v3v3, so 4 teams of 3. It's a naval heavy map, so it's a very, very open map. 3 teams went for heavy navy and fought tooth and nail in the water. They completely ignored the lowest rated team, which was up in the northeastern corner, allowing them to build a huge eco advantage and end the game with quite a few game enders. They ended up going for a Paragon, they got a couple of Yolanas, some Salvations, and then just absolutely rolled the rest of the map. So while this game included a lot of tools that contribute to the aforementioned maps being bad, forcing players to build game enders, the reason that these game enders popped up were not because the map demanded them as a win condition, but rather because 3 of the teams largely ignored the northeastern team. And that northeastern team then took that opportunity and built a strategy around it. So it was a reactive strategy, not necessarily the map is telling me that I need to do this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that a bad map is a map that takes the decision making out of the hands of the player as far as strategy is concerned. It makes a trade-off not even a trade-off anymore, because there is not another option other than to take one strategy in order to win the game. So with that, let's flip the coin and let's talk about what makes a good map. So a good map forces the player to make decisions and for there to be consequences and advantages for each particular plan. Now for this example, let's use Open Palms. It's a pretty popular ladder map, and let's say you're playing ladder on Open Palms. If you choose to push Tech 1 land very heavy with 10 plus land factories, you get yourself a lot of really, really good things. You get yourself some early map control, but you might on the other hand sacrifice tech, eco, or air control, putting yourself on a timer where you then need to win pretty quickly in say the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. Now on the flip side, if you take a more passive strategy with a little lighter Tech 1 phase, let's say 6 Tech 1 land factories, you are at an early disadvantage and need to hang on until your power curve hits. But as long as you can hang on to a couple of key positions, then you'll be in a good spot whenever you make an early transition to Tech 2 or go for air control, whatever your longer term game plan is. Now, both of these strategies are viable. Both of them have win conditions, advantages, and disadvantages. But if we compare that, to, say, Astro Crater, land in its entirety is almost a waste of mass, just because they will run into point defense, creating reclaim and allowing your opponent to get to game enders first. So going for any sort of strategy on Astro Crater that equivocates into early victory without going for nukes or game enders is almost always not going to necessarily work out for you. So now for the last question. If these maps are bad, which I believe that they are, why are they so popular? And I believe that this comes down to the complexity of Forged Alliance Forever. Let's be honest, there is a lot to keep up with, and even the most experienced players have and make many missteps within a game. So a short list of kind of things that you need to be paying attention to in a game. You need to make sure your army is taking good fights. You need to coordinate your eco upgrades on your mexes without overspending. Engineers need to assist the appropriate things at the right time. You have to protect your comm, but at the same time, using him as an early battle unit comes with a lot of advantages. You have to manage when to take up to the next level. You need to scout your opponent to know if they're about to crush you with a sneak experimental, and the list goes on and on and on. So that's just 6 things that you need to be paying attention to. And this isn't even a complete list that you need to think about as a player. This is a very, very complicated game with a steep learning curve. And these maps eliminate some of the things from this list, making the game a little bit more manageable and more approachable for players that have either never played an RTS before or have never played FAF before. And I don't really see this as entirely a bad thing. So going back to one of the things that we talked about earlier, where these maps teach players to play the game incorrectly, I'll position this as partly true. Partially, they do learn that they don't build Tech 1 land, or that, they don't need to manage, flanks, and they only need to focus on one particular avenue of attack. And those are definitely not good. But on the flip side, it does teach them the fundamentals of the economy, which is super important. When to upgrade mexes, how many mexes you can upgrade at the same time, how to actually use engineers to assist these mexes, ringing your mexes, upgrading them to Tech 3, making these jumps through the techs. These are all things that are good mechanics to learn, and things that might not be learned as well if you're throwing that as well as everything else at a new player that might never have seen a real-time strategy game before. So I don't think that this is entirely a bad thing. I do think that, it's a map where you kind of grow out of it, so to speak, like as a player. And I'm going to be doing a video in the future on the different ratings of players and what they're good at, what they're working on. I'm still thinking through all of that, but keep an eye out for that in the future. But everybody is going to, and if we come back to, this map, maybe it teaches some good things, maybe it teaches some bad things. That's fine. Either way, what it all comes down to, though, is everyone is going to enjoy this game in the way that they see fit. And even in the maps that we consider quote unquote good, players are still going to have preferences. For instance, I really don't enjoy playing Settins. Now, that doesn't really mean that Settins is a bad map, nor does it mean that the players that play Settins are bad players. It just means that I don't really enjoy playing that particular map. And I almost always default to Neuroxis Map Generator, where those are the kinds of games that I like to play. And both of those versions, like Neuroxis can sometimes spit out some weird maps, but by and large, Neuroxis Map Gen and Settins, both good maps. And players are still going to have preferences even after they're not playing quote unquote bad maps. I also don't really enjoy mods like Black Ops or Survival. But again, there's nothing wrong with players wanting to play the game in the way that they get the most fun out of it, because ultimately it's a game and you're supposed to be getting enjoyment out of it. So I guess what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, are these maps bad? Yeah, I think they're bad. Do they teach a bad way of play? Partially. They do teach some good mechanics, but they do teach some bad ones as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're going to enjoy Supreme Commander, that's the most important thing, is that you're enjoying FAF in the way that you most enjoy, and that you're making friends, building the community, etc. So we'll wrap it up there. I'm curious what y'all think. Let me know in the comments if you agree with the way that I've looked at these maps, or if you disagree, tell me. And if you disagree, tell me why. I know y'all aren't shy, so I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments below. But that's it from me today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.